This video is sponsored by DistroKid. Reverb is one of the most commonly used vocal effects, but it's also one of the easiest to misuse. If you aren't careful, reverb can create a lot of problems in a mix, potentially washing vocals out, making them muddy and less articulate, and leading to mixes that just sound sloppy and unprofessional. From choosing the right reverb plugin, to dialing in settings properly and blending the effect with the drive vocal to achieve a perfect balance between them, there are a lot of variables that can make or break a mix. In this video, I want to highlight 10 vocal reverb mistakes that amateurs make that are holding back their mixes from sounding professional. I'm going to share a variety of strategies and fixes you can use to overcome these mistakes moving forward. And don't worry, these are all mistakes that I've also made as I developed my skill set and honed my ear while building a successful career as a mixing engineer. But before we dive into the first mistake that amateurs make, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, DistroKid. DistroKid has added yet another awesome feature for the DIY artist that uses platform, and that would be Mixia. Mixia is the easiest way to master unlimited tracks instantly. Great for putting the final touches on your music before release, especially if mastering isn't your strong suit. Let's face facts, nothing will ever replace the artistry and expertise of a real human engineer like myself. But for artists who are short on time or resources, Mixia is a powerful tool that can help make your music sound great in a hurry. There are 3 simple steps to using Mixia. 1. Upload your mixed audio file to be mastered and optimized for streaming services. 2. Listen to the master and customize settings such as EQ and volume. And 3. Download your finished track and share it as you please, or even distribute it directly onto platforms through DistroKid. Your first master track is absolutely free, so I recommend you check it out and try it for yourself. And if you like it, it's only $99 per year to master unlimited tracks. You can sign up for DistroKid's awesome distribution services and save 7% off your first year using my link down in the description below. Now, as we begin to discuss the first mistake, I want to point out that I've put this list together in a specific order, being that the earlier mistakes are a bit more open and perhaps a bit more obvious at the same time, while towards the end we'll get into mistakes that are more advanced and easier to miss. So whether you're new to mixing or you're a seasoned pro, I guarantee that one of these tips will be helpful for you on your next mix, so definitely watch this video all the way through till the end. With that being said, the first mistake I want to talk about is using reverb to save a vocal. A mistake that many amateurs make is they apply reverb to a vocal to cover up the problems with it while doing nothing to correct those problems in the first place. I'm talking about issues like volume inconsistencies, harsh sibilance, boominess, muddiness, and more. When you feed a vocal that has problems into a reverb, sometimes it can mask those problems, but it can also amplify them and make them worse, as now all of those problems are being placed into a reverberated environment. My philosophy is we should first focus on cleaning up a vocal via manual editing and processes like EQ, compression, and more to improve it and make it sound as good as it possibly can, so that way when we add reverb to the vocal, it enhances it and adds a nice textural quality to it, rather than hope that the reverb covers up the blemishes. The point is, don't rely on reverb to save you from the hard work that's required to achieve a great vocal sound, or bail you out if there's deeper problems related to production, recording, and editing. And that leads me to the second mistake, which is using reverb instead of another effect. A common misconception, especially among new mixers or those that are unfamiliar with the mixing process, is that reverb is the same as echo or delay. Reverb creates a sense of depth and space, making the sound feel like it exists within a particular environment. Reverb involves a dense cluster of reflections that decay over time, often blurring together. Delay, on the other hand, repeats the signal at set intervals, which can be manipulated for rhythmic and spatial effects. Imagine singing in a cathedral, which produces a reverb effect, versus shouting in a canyon, which produces a delay effect. The cathedral's reverb creates a continuous, lush sound that decays naturally, while the canyon's delay produces distinct echoes that repeat back to you. Being aware of this distinction can help you avoid this mistake in the future, as it really all boils down to intention. Is the goal to put the vocal into a space? Or is it to create a specific repeated pattern? Or is it something else altogether? Depending on your answer, you may want to reach for a reverb, or you may want to reach for a different effect altogether. And that leads us to the third mistake that mixers make, which is applying reverb directly instead of using a send. There are times when it makes sense to apply a reverb directly to a sound, but more often than not, I'm actually relying on a send instead. By sending all vocals via a bus to a single auxiliary track with a reverb on it, I'm able to achieve a number of benefits. First of all, this enables better control. When using Ascend, I can control the wet reverb level on an aux track and the original dry signal level independently, allowing for more precise adjustments without affecting the original track. Sends also allow for easier mix adjustments. If I need to adjust the reverb settings, I can do it once on the send track rather than adjusting a reverb plugin directly on each individual track, saving time and ensuring consistency. Using Ascend also produces a uniform sound. By sending multiple tracks to the same reverb send, I can create a consistent reverb sound across all of those tracks, leading to a cohesive and unified mix. And a final benefit I'll mention relates to CPU and resource efficiency. Applying reverb to multiple tracks can be CPU intensive. However, using a single reverb send for multiple tracks reduces the overall CPU load, making your DAW run more smoothly and efficiently. Overall, using Ascend can enable you to have a better workflow, so if you aren't using this method yet, I'd highly recommend you try it out on your next mix. Now, the fourth mistake that mixers make is they only use one type of reverb in a session. If you watch my 7 vocal effects I use in every mix video, you know that I start with 2 reverbs in my mixing session always, one being a tighter plate reverb and another being an elongated hall type of reverb. There are typically 5 types of reverbs we can rely on in a mix, being hall, chamber, room, plate, and spring, each with their own unique texture and characteristics. If I want to have a longer decay time so the reverb lingers more, I can use a hall reverb. But if I want a tighter, less lingering sound that still creates a sense of space, I can reach for a plate reverb. When starting out, a lot of mixers will limit how many reverbs they use in a session. However, I think it's a good idea to have a couple of reverbs in your session right from jump, if for nothing else to provide different textural options and sonic characteristics that you may want to tap into at different points of your mix. One of my favorite approaches is to use 2 different reverbs on 2 different sounds to create contrast between them. For example, I may apply a plate reverb to the lead vocal and then a hall reverb to the background vocals, which will help each of them stand out from each other by putting them into their own unique space. Ultimately, having access to multiple reverbs like this will offer more flexibility and allow me to more precisely affect the vocals without being limited to one reverb option. And that leads me to the 5th mistake that I want to talk about, which is present on almost every mix that comes across my desk at first, and that is using too much reverb. The reality is reverb can push sounds into the background and lead to a loss of clarity and definition. This means vocals can sound muddy, blurry, less intimate, hazy, or just lacking punch in general. It's important to be calculated when applying reverb to a vocal so that we're enhancing it, but not overtaking it or pushing it into the background and running into some of these issues that I've just mentioned. But a suggestion that I have for you watching is to study songs that you like and pay attention to how much reverb is present on the vocal in those mixes. And in comparison to your track and the amount of reverb you've applied, how does it stack up? A lot of times there's much less reverb on the songs that we like than we think. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you need to just blindly copy artists that you like, but I think referencing is a good idea, especially if you're struggling with nailing your reverb sound or ending up with vocals that just sound washed out and problematic. Another strategy I like to use in this situation is to manipulate the level of the reverb. Sometimes I'll achieve the right amount of send level from my vocal, which allows me to achieve the perfect amount of ambience, but the actual level of the reverb itself is too loud and present. For that reason, I'll go into the level of the reverb auxiliary track itself and re-blend it to taste, typically bringing it down to infinite and then bringing it up until I have just the right amount of reverb level in my mix. Whenever I do this, I always find that I set my reverb level a little bit lower than I thought I initially wanted it, but of course with more precision that allows me to achieve a cleaner and more balanced end result. And if you like the reverb levels that you've set, then perhaps these next mistakes can help you sculpt your reverb sound into something that sounds more appropriate via the settings. Which leads us to our 6th mistake, which is not using pre-delay. Pre-delay is a reverb setting that creates a slight delay between the dry signal and the onset of the reverb. It basically delays when the reverb effect becomes audible, allowing the dry vocal to maintain an upfront and clear position as the initial attack of phrases comes through without being masked by the reverb. Without pre-delay, the reverb starts immediately, which can be particularly problematic for elements with sharp transients, which vocals typically consist of. In order to use the right amount of pre-delay, we could do some manual calculations, but I'd personally recommend using a reverb time calculator, which you can find for free online, and I'll link to one down in the description below for you to use on your next mix. Typically, this pre-delay setting is at least 30 milliseconds, but it could be more or less depending on the tempo of your song and how much pre-delay is needed to deliver an upfront vocal vocal sound. Building on that, we could talk about another setting that a lot of mixers get wrong in mistake 7, which is using the wrong decay time. The decay time refers to the length of time it takes for the reverb tail to die away to inaudibility after the original sound source has stopped. Basically, how long does the reverb linger and stay in the mix after the vocal has stopped being performed? Depending on the type of space you're trying to emulate, the decay time is going to vary. Shorter decay times, such as 0.5 to 1.5 seconds, can mimic smaller spaces like rooms or small studios, while longer decay times, such as 2 to 6 seconds or more, can simulate larger spaces like halls, cathedrals, or other environments. This is why I mentioned I like to have different reverbs in my session to basically provide different decay times and textures in the process. Many mixers will use whatever the default decay time is or set one randomly without thinking much of it, but the reality is we should set our decay time while being considerate of how long we want our reverb to linger in the mix and within the context of our track's tempo. By timing the decay properly, we can create a cleaner sounding mix while achieving an ambience that complements our vocal and tempo better. In order to calculate the decay time, much like pre-delay, we can do some manual calculations, but once again, it's going to be a lot easier to use a reverb time calculator, which will automatically determine the most appropriate decay times based on your tempo and the type of reverb you're after. The reality is there isn't a single decay time that'll work. Instead, it'll depend on how long you want your reverb to linger after the vocal stops or pauses. For example, if my tempo is 140 BPM and I want an elongated hall type of reverb that is 2 bars long, then I'll need to set my decay time somewhere around 3,375 milliseconds. However, if I want a tighter room type of reverb that is comparable to a half note, then I'd set my decay to roughly 843 milliseconds. These are just two examples that are entirely dependent on the BPM of the track being 140, and there are other decay settings that I could also use that are actually longer, shorter, and in between these two based on that tempo. But hopefully this exemplifies the point and gives you some more concrete options in terms of which decay time to use in your future mixes. You can use that same reverb time calculator I mentioned earlier, which again is going to be in the description below, to calculate the most appropriate decay time for your tracks. And that leads us to the 8th mistake, which is not shaping the reverb's tone with EQ. Reverb can be messy, especially after being sent a vocal which can span a broad range of frequencies from low to high. While we generally want to preserve most of the frequency spectrum of a dry vocal, give or take some problematic resonances, the same can't be said for the reverb effect itself. For example, having too much low and low mid energy in a reverb can produce a muddy, washed out sound that takes away from the impact of the vocal if it's overly present. Similarly, having too much high-frequency content can make a mix brittle and mask other sounds in the high end, such as the vocal air or even percussion such as hi-hats. While we may start our reverb sound in a basic manner by simply sending our signal to an auxiliary track with a reverb on it, we should also sculpt it further with some EQ in order to clean it up, keeping it focused and even make room for the dry vocal. A famous EQ mixing trick that's out there is the Abbey Road mixing trick, which I often use in my own mixes as well. This involves adding an EQ before the reverb and using a high-pass filter to cut the low frequencies as high as 600 Hz, which helps remove the boomy, muddy, and rumbly frequencies of the reverb's reflections. Following that, we'll use a low-pass filter to remove the unnecessary high-end reflections towards 6K and above, which can create space for cymbals and higher-end percussion as well as vocal air. To take it a step further, we can apply a second EQ after the reverb to boost or cut specific frequencies depending on the track to shape the reverb even more. For example, I may cut a bit of frequencies with a bell around 3K in order to make room for the dry vocal, and using an MSEQ in particular can be good for this, as we can remove frequency content in the mid-band of the reverb only where the vocal is most dominant. While these are some general numbers that I've given you, of course use your ears and judgment when doing this yourself. But the overall idea and approach will apply, with some gentle filtering and strategic cutting and shaping where appropriate. Now let's talk about the 9th mistake that a lot of amateurs make when it comes to reverb, which is letting reverb get in the way of dry vocals. Building on the previous point, reverb can get messy, and even if you're using settings like pre-delay or even processes like EQ, there's still a good chance that your reverb can climb up and get in the way of your dry vocal and lead to an unintelligible sound. For that reason, controlling reverb effectively in order to prioritize your dry vocal is key. I specifically like following my reverb up with multi-band sidechain compression and having my dry vocal track trigger it to prioritize prioritize it over the effect. Using a multiband compressor allows us to focus on a frequency band where the dry vocal is most dominant, typically between 2 to 5K depending on the vocalist, and reduce the presence of this band every time the dry vocal is actually being performed. You could also use a standard sidechain compressor or a volume riding plugin to achieve a similar effect. And of course, you can rely on other more manual processes like volume automation to do some volume rides in order to achieve the right blend between the reverb sound and the dry vocal sound, which I'd recommend you do anyways. So now let's talk about the final mistake that I want to highlight in this video, which is not enhancing the reverb. So far, we've been focused on using reverb correctly and minimizing its negative effects. However, it's equally important to not shy away from enhancing the reverb to create a richer, more engaging sound. And one of my favorite ways to enhance a reverb is through saturation. Saturation can add warmth, depth, and character to a reverb, making it sound more lush and immersive. It can enhance a reverb by generating additional harmonics derived from the original signal. These harmonics are typically higher in the frequency spectrum, providing a complementary sound that can add richness, clarity, and warmth. By applying saturation to a reverb, you can make the reverb tail sound more interesting and textured, which helps avoid a flat or sterile sound. This can be especially effective in genres where you want a more analog or warmer flavor within your music. Beyond just warmth, saturation can be used creatively to distort the reverb slightly, giving it a unique character. This can be useful for creating a signature sound in a mix, or even adding a touch of unpredictability. Overall, I'd say don't be afraid to experiment with saturation on a reverb in your next mix. You might just be impressed with how much it enhances it, whether used in a subtle way to make the reverb poke out a little bit more, or if you push it over the edge and produce a heavily distorted reverb sound, which might actually add a really cool character to your music and stick out to your listeners. And while saturation is one of my favorite enhancement strategies, it's definitely not the only one. We can use additive EQ, stereo widening, and even modulation effects like choruses, flangers, and phasers to enhance a reverb sound even further. I'm not going to talk about them in this video, but I do think it is worth mentioning before we wrap things up. Now, aside from reverb, I'd say that delay is another effect that is commonly used when mixing vocals, and I know that I rely on it with every mix that I do. For that reason, I'd recommend you check out my 10 vocal delay tips video, which I'm going to leave on screen right now for you to watch next. If you got value out of the video, please smash that like button blue. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing so you can see some more mixing tutorials like this in the future. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I look forward to helping you again soon. Peace.
5